The Basilisk, a 12-inch long venomous serpent.
Wait, no. The basilisk is a huge snake that can turn people into stone.
No. Look at the monster manuals. It's a giant multi-legged lizard that turns people into stone.
Well, I heard it had the head and body of a rooster, the wings of a bat, and tail of a snake, and it killed you just by breathing on you.
Okay. Clearly, we have a lot to talk about. But first, my name is Garvin, and I read things and chatter about them on the internet for your entertainment. And today we're looking at, well, it's really a whole mythical ecosystem, honestly, as we're looking at 4 mythical creatures and we're tracing their relationships. And we're going to start with the creature that might be the most confusing of the lot, the Basilisk. The oldest recorded writings we have about the Basilisk come to us from the Roman Pliny the Elder, who described the Basilisk in his work entitled Natural History. Now, this was released between 77 and 79 AD, which was about 10 years before Pliny the Elder's death, investigating the eruption that destroyed Pompeii. And this was a monster of a work. It was 37 books divided into 10 volumes, and is the single largest written work to survive from the Roman Empire to the modern day. In Natural History, Pliny describes the basilisk as a small snake, about 12 inches long, incredibly venomous, moving in an upright posture like a cobra, but instead of a hood, it has a crown-like crest on his head. It also had white stripes or spots. Some of my sources disagree on whether it's stripes or spots, and to be fair, my sources disagree on a lot, and we're going to get into that more as we go forward. Now, we're pretty sure that belief in the basilisk pre-existed this writing, because basilisk itself is a Greek name meaning little king, and originally referred to that crown-like crest I told you about, but as time went on, it began to refer more to the idea that the basilisk was the king of all serpents. And to be fair, even if you just went off of Pliny's work, there's plenty of reasons to consider this the monarch of snakes. This snake is so beyond venomous, it's ridiculous. Its very breath scorches and shrivels plants, and it can make rocks burst. Water in its presence becomes so polluted and so foul that drinking it is death. According to Pliny and other sources around his time, you could spear a basilisk from horseback, but the venom would travel up the spear and kill the man and the horse. This is some ridiculously powerful poison. And the legend would only grow over time, and with it, so would the powers of the basilisk. By the time we get to the 3rd century AD, the Roman writer Gaius Julius Solinus is saying that basilisks can kill with their very gaze, and birds flying overhead burst if the basilisk stares at them too long. That's incredibly powerful for a small snake. Now, while in Pliny's time they considered the basilisk to be a destructive but natural creature, it's already moving into being more of a supernatural monster. In fact, an example of this would be in 200 AD, where the basilisk starts appearing in the Alexander Romance. And to explain that, the Alexander Romance is, to put it in modern terms, it's a fantasy novel with Alexander the Great starring as the main character. And in at least one version, he fights and kills a basilisk as part of his journey to the lands of darkness to find the water of life that grants immortality. I talk about that a bit in one of my mermaid videos, and to be honest, the Alexander Romance is a video subject in of itself, but just keep this in mind as an idea that the basilisk is moving from natural snake to supernatural monster here. Its supernatural reputation was growing so fast that at this point, there were Romans who even believed the basilisk was responsible for the creation of the Libyan or North African desert, and that traveling into the desert alone would run the risk of being preyed upon by a basilisk. However, you could fend these things off by bringing along a weasel, which was believed to be able to kill a basilisk, although in some stories, this is also fatal for the weasel, so keep that in mind. Medieval sources would also suggest bringing along a crystal globe to reflect a basilisk's killing glare back onto it, or bringing a rooster because the crow of a cock is deadly to a basilisk. This isn't the last time roosters would show up in this story, so keep that in mind. It was believed that the basilisk inhabited large parts of Africa and some areas in India. In Ethiopia, in particular, it was believed to hunt the Yale. Now, let's talk about the Yale for a moment here. It's another mythical creature with the body of a horse, the tail of an elephant, and the jaws of a boar, which is an interesting picture, isn't it? It has horns about a cubit long, which in modern measurements is about 1.5 feet, or 45.72 centimeters. What's really interesting here is that the horns are incredibly flexible and can be pointed in any direction. So, when fighting, the Yale will always have one horn pointed away from its enemy, so if the horn it's fighting with gets broken, the other can be deployed to replace it. Basilisks don't fight the Yale, though. They wait for the Yale to fall asleep, then sneak up and bite it right between the eyes so that they can be sure their venom will make the Yale's eyes burst and kill it. That's gruesome, but I gotta admit it's an effective way to kill something. The basilisk also had its own predators, though. I already mentioned the weasel, and the weasel would become, at least in Europe, the basilisk's primary opponent. And it was believed that if a weasel was bitten or otherwise afflicted with basilisk poison, it would treat the injuries with helping of rue, which is a type of herb native to the Mediterranean Sea. In some stories, the weasel would even prepare for battle against the basilisk by rolling around in rue, heavily coating its fur with the stuff. There was, however, another creature known to hunt and kill the basilisk, the ichneumon. It's described very much in a way that makes you think of a mongoose with a much longer, more lion-like tail. In fact, most scholars will tell you that this is just a second or third-hand description of an Egyptian mongoose, but to be fair, a lot of scholars also say the early descriptions of a basilisk are just second or third-hand descriptions of a cobra. So, I suppose that all evens out. Getting back to the myth, though, the ichneumon was said to be an incredible predator of venomous snakes and other reptiles, coating itself in mud and attacking, using its tail to confuse and bait the snake into striking at its tail so it could then lunge out and rip out the snake's throat. It was even said to prey on crocodiles by waiting for them to fall asleep on the riverbank, crawling down its throat after tickling its jaws open with its tail, and then gnawing its way out of the crocodile through its stomach. This, of course, is lethal for the crocodile. Man, nature is scary in these videos, isn't it? Although, I gotta admit, this sounds less than how a mongoose would kill something and more like how a honey badger on meth would kill something. But honey badgers are also from the area, so I suppose that tracks. That said, I did find a source, the Irish Penny Journal, that claimed that ichneumon were actually very tameable. As long as you kept them from killing anything, they were perfectly safe. Be advised, though, according to the Irish Penny Journal, once the ichneumon has killed and tasted blood, there is no going back, and its savage nature is awake forever. Circling back to the basilisk, though, the myth gets weirder as we get to medieval Europe. Now, at this point, it had grown in size and acquired a very unnatural origin. Remember how roosters were said to be able to kill it by crowing? Well, they're getting pulled deeper into this story. Now, my sources disagree on where this story came from. Phantasmagoria blames Isidore of Seville, a scholar from 7th century Spain. Wikipedia blames the Venerable Bede of England, of also the 7th century, while the Book of Beasts blames Alexander Neckham, a 12th century scholar from England. But the myth goes that if you have an old rooster over 7 years old that lays an egg and it's incubated on a manure pile by a toad, or in some minority of the stories, a snake, a small snake-like creature will hatch out, and over time, it will grow into a basilisk. And while this story might sound kind of silly to us, this was taken seriously enough in medieval Europe that we know for a fact that the people of Basel, Switzerland, executed a rooster they believed was laying eggs in 1474, and it was not an isolated occurrence. Now, from what I've been able to find, there's several explanations for why you might have an egg-laying rooster. First of all, due to hormone imbalances, some hens actually come out looking very much like roosters, and without careful inspection, you wouldn't realize this hen was a rooster until it started laying eggs. And according to some sources, there are secretions that older roosters will produce that can look incredibly egg-like. So it's entirely possible that they had a rooster-looking hen, or just an older rooster producing these secretions, but it would have looked like a rooster laying an egg to them. So, while the basilisk started out as a fictional but possibly natural creature, at this point it was a full-blown supernatural monster. And in medieval Europe, it became a symbol of evil. I do want to note here real quick that in the Near East, where the myth of the basilisk was present, it gained more of a symbol as a guardian of treasures or secret places. But in medieval Europe, this thing was a servant of the devil and often used that way in stories. The idea of the basilisk as an evil creature grew really deep roots into European folklore, to the point that during the Reformation, Protestants would use the basilisk as a symbol of the Pope to emphasize that he was a servant of Satan. Speaking as a Protestant Christian, I will admit was not cool of us. I would like to apologize to the Catholics for that. I'm sorry that my ancestors used the basilisk to accuse the Pope of serving Satan. I hope we don't do it again. Moving on. Getting back to the myth. That origin story would get even weirder as time went on, because I guess a rooster egg hatched by a toad wasn't strange enough. So, in the expanded story, that small snake-like creature that got hatched would flee into holes underground, where it would grow older and larger and become more dangerous. It would grow legs and bat wings and a rooster-like head as it approached adulthood. This creature, over time, became more distinct from the older snake-like basilisk myth, and confusion would arise around it and the snake basilisk until in the 14th century the English author Chaucer calls it the basilcock. And then by the 1600s we have the name Cockatrice. Just to be clear, the rooster-like head, legs and wing body came before the name Cockatrice. It existed in art and other depictions as a basilisk, but the name Cockatrice did appear by the 1600s and stuck. So, I'm going to use that to refer to this creature. Cockatrice is fairly similar to the basilisk in that it can kill with a gaze or a touch, and it is hunted by the weasel, which is now fully immune to the cockatrice's dark powers. An example of fictional natural selection, if you will. And the cockatrice will die if it hears the crow of a young, healthy rooster, just like the early stories of the basilisk. And that kind of helps reinforce the idea that the cockatrice is a sort of evil, degenerate mirror image of a rooster. In depictions of the cockatrice from the 1600s up until the 1900s, it became more dragon-like, although from what I've seen in modern fantasy depictions, the cockatrice has swung back to being a very chicken-like creature. A lot of modern fantasy has cockatrices and basilisks as two very distinct creatures, but from what I can find, the idea of these being two different creatures is a result of confusion over language, but it is a great example of how messy mythology and folklore can be. There is no real canon here, guys, because the beliefs and ideas behind them change over time and over distance. What English folks in 600 AD believe is going to be a lot different from what Romans down in Italy and North Africa believed 500 years before that. And that is something to keep in mind if you study mythology, religion, folklore, or even history. You need to know when your source is writing as well as where they're writing, or you're gonna get confused or pulled into bad assumptions. Having said all that, let's talk about a actual medieval story about a basilisk. the Basilisk of Warsaw. And I'm just going to note real quick, this is the second story taking place in Warsaw I've shared on this channel. The first one was about how mermaids played a role in the founding of Warsaw, and that even involves the story of a mermaid that was dating a griffin somehow. Look, some things you just don't speculate about. I will link that video below, though. Getting back to the Basilisk, this story goes as follows. In the late 1500s, in the city of Warsaw, the children of a knife seller went missing one day, and their nursemaid and their mother went looking for them, and found them laying down quietly in the basement of an abandoned building. The nurse, who found them first, called out to them, and when they didn't respond, she didn't think anything of it, perhaps assuming they were playing some sort of silly hide-and-seek game that small children will do, and went into the basement to go get them. As she reached the bottom of the stairs and took a deep breath, she fell over and was dead before she hit the floor. The mother had arrived just in time to see the nursemaid fall over dead, and she decided not to go alone into the basement to investigate this, making her smarter than your average horror movie character. Instead, the mother ran home screaming at the top of her lungs to everyone she could find what happened, and this caused the city folk to gather around that abandoned building, and after some discussion, they tried to fish the dead bodies out with fire hooks. They managed to get the bodies out of that basement, and what they discovered terrified them. The skins of all three of the dead had gone purple dark, and their bodies were swollen, and their tongues were bulging from their mouths, and their eyes bulging from their sockets. It's at this point that the king's doctor, chamberlain, and possibly the smartest man in Warsaw enters the story, Benedictus. And he takes one look at this and announces that it's clear as day that a basilisk is living in that basement, and to everyone's terror he explains that its very presence was poisoning the air, and as it grew older, larger, and stronger, the poison would get worse and spread further from its lair. The basilisk had to go, or the city was gonna go. That makes me feel like I should name this basilisk Prince Paris, but I'll try to hold back on that urge. If you don't understand why I'm saying that, you should go watch my video from December about the fall of Troy. Sorry, I'll get back to this. So, they had a problem. This basilisk had to go, but going into the basement unprotected was fatal. Benedictus, however, had a plan. First, he went to the city prison, where a Sicilian named John Barrer was being held awaiting execution, and he pulled some strings, and John was offered a full pardon if he would go down into the basement and get the basilisk. Likely figuring that he was done for either way, John accepted. So they covered his whole body in leather, which had hundreds of tiny little mirrors sewn onto the outward-facing side. And they covered his eyes and his mouth, and they gave him a torch and a rake. Now, it says his eyelids were fastened on top of his eyes, so that's why I say his eyes were covered, and that sounds like they were closed, so I'm not sure what that torch is doing for him. Despite this, when he was thrown into the basement, it took him about an hour, but he did find the basilisk and used the rake to pin it down and drag it out into the sunlight, which, according to the story, weakened its poison enough that they were able to examine it even though it was still alive. And it was described as having a blue crown-like crest, the eyes of a toad, and a tail that curved back over its body that was covered in the colorful hues of various poisonous animals. And it's there that the story ends without explaining how they killed the basilisk, but since Warsaw is still there, I think we can assume they did kill it. And it's on that note, with Warsaw saved for yet another day, that we're going to end this week's video. And I hope you found it informative, or at least entertaining. If you did, please leave a like, a comment, or consider subscribing, as all of that helps me in my eternal battle against the dread Lord Algorithm. Terror be on his name. Speaking of support, special thanks to Big Steve. I hope you never find a rooster's egg, buddy. Next week, by vote of my patrons, we're returning to the tradition of Dick Month, filled K-Dick, where we're going to look at one of his works that's been adapted into mass media, like films or television. I hope you join me for that, but until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and of course, keep reading!